I do believe I have been upstaged by a whale. Or at least the wolves have. The wolves lighthouse has been upstaged by a whale. So we'll make this quick. This is Southwest Wolf Lighthouse, built in 1871. And we're at the southeast point of southern Wolf Island.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. The problem with the rocky coast of Maine is that it's rocky. For centuries, ships have wrecked in our waters. So in the 1700s, Maine began to see the first lighthouses. And by the time Maine was just becoming a new state, lots of lighthouses began construction. The boom lasted for 150 years and then some, so these traffic lights of the sea now dot the Maine coast. And each one has a story to tell. We started telling those stories last week. Today is part 2, recapping an 18 lighthouse tour undertaken by Bar Harbor Whale Watch. 4 times a summer, they send one of their fast Whale Watch catamarans on a tour of these lighthouses. On July 29th, the Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour started in Bar Harbor and went all the way up to Back Bay, New Brunswick. Of the 18 lighthouses we visited, 6 were Canadian, or 5, depending on whether the U.S. or Canada owns Machias Seal Island. We still argue about that one, claimed by both countries. Today, we're visiting 9 more lighthouses. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. The morning is Saturday, July 29th. The vessel is the Friendship 5, a jet-powered catamaran that can hit 33 knots or better, giving it the speed and range to make a 170-mile round trip while stopping at every lighthouse along the way. On board, we have several lighthouse experts and a few naturalists in case we encounter good birds and whales. We're about to hit an unusual lighthouse in Lubeck. But before we do, let's go over a few things we learned last week. In the beginning, lighthouses were just big torches by the sea, going all the way back to the Romans and Phoenicians and Greeks and Egyptians. The Egyptian lighthouse in Alexandria was built 300 years before Christ and was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Originally, they just marked the entrance to a harbor. It wasn't until much later that they marked danger. As technology improved, fuels got better, going from wood to whale oil to kerosene to compressed gases and now even to solar power. And lenses got better, concentrating and focusing the beam so that it could be seen better, farther. The Fresnel lens was invented in the early 1800s, grinding concentric prisms into the lenses to increase efficiency and reduce weight. These Fresnel lenses came along just as our lighthouses started springing up, so you hear that term a lot when describing Maine lighthouses. They came in 6 sizes called orders, with first order being the largest. Most of Maine's lighthouses tended to have 4th and 5th order lenses, but there were a few bigger ones too. Today, about a quarter of our lighthouses have VRB-25 optical systems made in New Zealand, which is a series of lenses rotating around a big incandescent bulb. And the most recent changes put LEDs in some of our smaller lighthouses, including the one we are just stopping at now.
Okay, we have Lubeck Channel Light right in front of us, fondly known to local people as the spark plug.
Jeremy D'Entremont is president of the American Lighthouse Foundation. We're lucky to have him on board. He wrote the book on Maine lighthouses, and he's handling the interpretation for all of the American lighthouses, which I emphasize because we are mid-channel, closer to Canadian soil and Campobello than we are to American land.
This type of lighthouse is often referred to as a spark plug type light for obvious reasons. Looks kind of like a spark plug. In the early days, when some of these were built before the advent of spark plugs, they were sometimes called coffee pot lights. This one was built in 1890. It was automated way back in 1939. Still an active automated light. You can see it has a bit of a list, about something like a 6-degree list to it, leaning a little bit to the right from where we are right now. It's 40 feet tall. The light is 53 feet above mean high water here. It had a 5th order Fresnel lens, now has a 155 millimeter solar powered light. Actually, Bob, am I correct in that? Do you know, or has it been? It's an LED. It is now an LED. I was looking at it and thinking that looks like an LED. And it still has a fog signal as well, 1 blast every 15 seconds, Mariner activated fog signal. So this light, as I mentioned, was built in 1890 to mark the way through Lubeck Narrows, the area where we are right now, between Lubeck and Campobello Island. And there was a lot of shipping traffic around here, largely because Lubeck was the center of the sardine industry. There are actually 20 sardine packing plants in Lubeck at one time. There's 0 now. One of the old plants, I believe, was made into a museum of the sardine industry. But the sardine industry, which used to be so big on the Maine coast, is pretty much gone now. The caisson, the lower part, the cast iron caisson that's sunk down into the bottom here, a 1,200-pound fog bell operated by machinery was also installed here when it first went into service. Went into service on the last day of 1890. This was a stag station. No families ever lived inside this lighthouse. Stag station, or males only. First principal keeper was Frederick W. Morong from a well-known Maine lighthouse family. His assistant was Loring W. Myers. There were 5 levels of living space inside the lighthouse. There was a keeper named Nathaniel Alley who was in charge here in the late 30s, and he was alone on duty one day in 1939 when he was overcome by gas from the coal stove. The captain of the Grand Manan Ferry thought it was strange that he didn't see anybody on duty when he went by, and became suspicious. People investigated, and Alley was found. He was unconscious. He was taken for medical treatment, but he soon died. And shortly after that, this light was automated, converted to a acetylene gas system. So it's been automated since 1939. What a pretty sky we have here right now. Beautiful view. In 1989, the light was scheduled to be discontinued, but local residents mounted a Save the Spark Plug campaign, and they actually handed out automobile spark plugs to publicize the cause. Then in 1992, a $700,000 renovation restored the lighthouse to its best shape in a long time. They stabilized the foundation. New plates were installed in the caisson. 200 cubic yards of concrete were pumped in. 12 piles were driven through the caisson into the bedrock. One of the piles was driven 149 feet deep. The lighthouse still has a 6-degree list, as I mentioned, but it's considered stable at least. In 2006, this lighthouse was made available to a new owner, but no nonprofits applied, and as a result, the lighthouse was auctioned under the guidelines of the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act. In July 2007, it was auctioned to Gary Zaremba for a high bid of $46,000. Gary Zaremba is president of Artisan Restoration Group of New York City.
We're talking about the spark plug, one of only 3 lighthouses of this type in Maine. If you've been to Lubeck, you're certainly familiar with it. It's right out there in the channel between South Lubeck and Campobello. Bob D'Entremont is president of the American Lighthouse Foundation, and he's doing most of the talking here. There was a rush to automate this lighthouse back in 1939 because fumes from a coal stove overwhelmed and killed the last lighthouse keeper in 1934. We're on the Grand Slam Tour, an annual offering of Bar Harbor Whale Watch. This trip took place on July 29th, and we're about to enter Canada. We'll take a break while our catamaran steers carefully under the International Bridge to Campobello, and we'll meet you in about 3 minutes at Mulholland Light. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. We're doing the Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour with Bar Harbor Whale Watch. This was an all-day trip on Saturday, July 29th. We went up the coast from Bar Harbor all the way to New Brunswick and hit 18 lighthouses. Today is part 2 of that adventure. So far, we've hit all the coastal lighthouses from Bar Harbor to Lubeck. We're about to hit 6 just over the border in Canada, starting with the one that you can so easily see across the channel from downtown Lubeck. At this point, we're also switching narrators. Chris Miles was a lighthouse keeper for the Canadian Coast Guard for many years, including some of the lighthouses we're visiting on this trip. Chris now lives in Nova Scotia, and he's one of the founders of a lighthouse preservation group there. He knows these lighthouses inside and out. It took a moment to get our catamaran into position for the bridge, but here we go.
All right, folks, we are approaching Mulholland Point, and the bridge we're about to go under is actually the reason that this lighthouse doesn't operate anymore. Because once it went into place, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial Bridge, there was no need for a lighthouse anymore. But the lighthouse was first thought about in 1882, and built in 1884 and lit in 1985, which is kind of indicative of the bureaucratic delays that sometimes come up when public structures like lighthouses are being built. But I think a good way to start talking about Mulholland Point is that it's a light that symbolizes the close relationship that Canada and the US have just across the channel from the States. And it's interesting that Campobello is a Canadian island and you have to go through the US to get to Campobello, which is rather interesting. So the light was constructed in 1882, or 1884 rather, and finally lit in 1885. And it did have a resident keeper, a keeper who lived nearby. There's not a lot of history known on this particular light. Earlier on we were talking about wooden lighthouses not being particularly common in Maine, and this is a very traditional and very common design in Canada. 8-sided tower with an iron lantern. Wood was used for Canadian lighthouses because wood was plentiful. And of course it was in the States as well, but we did not have the flush federal coffers that you folks had for your lovely brick and stone towers. So we built these beautiful little wooden towers. Fortunately, some of these towers remain to this day for us to enjoy. And here we are passing under the bridge. Lighthouse on our starboard side. I'm sure many of you are aware of the connection between Campobello and the Roosevelt family. Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy from 1913 to 1920. And he made an inspection trip along the Maine coast during that time on the USS Flusser. Apparently he took the helm, and the future president captained the vessel through the narrow channel, which we're in now between Lubeck and Campobello Island. And apparently Lieutenant William F. Bull Halsey was a little bit concerned about his navigational prowess, but he later wrote, "As Mr. Roosevelt made his first turn, I saw him look aft and check the swing of our stern. My worries were over. He knew his business." And as I mentioned before, the navigational lights on the bridge made this particular lighthouse obsolete. And in 1963 it was discontinued. A quick note about wooden lighthouses as well. As you can well imagine, just as those of you who own wooden houses know, it's a huge amount of maintenance to keep these up. So in a tower like this, which is well over 100 years old, it's wonderful to see. We're about to come up to the oldest wooden lighthouse in Canada, I think in North America as well, at Head Harbour, East Quoddy Light. But maintaining wooden towers is constant. You're always painting and replacing rotten wood. The lantern on this is a lantern that would have been designed and developed at the Dominion Lighthouse Depot in Prescott, Ontario. That was almost like the equivalent of your Staten Island Lighthouse Depot in New York, where all of the lenses and lanterns in Canada were put together, either designed or put together. And this lantern is no exception. You can see the wind vane on the top. Especially important in the days of kerosene lights, because you didn't want the wind blowing directly into your lantern. It could smoke up or put out your light.
As Chris Miles says, our next stop is the oldest wooden lighthouse in North America. It's up on East Quoddy Head at Head Harbour Passage on Campobello. Incidentally, if you're listening to the show right now, it means you're probably missing the second big lighthouse tour being conducted by Bar Harbor Whale Watch. This was the weekend for their Mid-Coast Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour from Bar Harbor to Matinicus Rock, hitting 16 lighthouses along the way. There are 2 more lighthouse tours coming up. On the morning of Saturday, September 16th, they'll hit 7 lighthouses down east. Then on Saturday, October 14th, I will be hosting an unusual trip from Bar Harbor to Bangor, up the Penobscot River, hitting 10 lighthouses during fall foliage season. Details at barharborwales.com. barharborwales.com.
Our first view of Head Harbour Lighthouse. Look at that. Well, if there ever was an archetypal Canadian lighthouse, red and white and freshly painted, I think this is it, and this is exciting. I have not seen this lighthouse this close since 1993, and in 1993 it had been destaffed for about 6 years and was not in the best of shape. One of the oldest wooden lights in North America, quite possibly the oldest. It's the oldest in Canada, the oldest existing. Built in 1829. And I guess we could call it a working partner to West Quaddy that we've come from just recently, and also from Bliss Islands, which we're going to see shortly as well. So this is a place, if you've been here, you know that you have to think smart coming out here, because you have to get out at low tide, and once you get out, that's great, but then you have to realize that you have about a 7-meter or 20-foot tide to contend with, and if you linger, you might be spending a little extra time at Head Harbour. I would say this is, for the area that we're in, it's as close as you could call to a rock lighthouse, because you are separate from the mainland. It's a bit of a slog to get out there, and when the tide is high, you're completely separate from Campobello Island. Completed in 1829, and the April 10th, 1830 edition of the Courier newspaper in St. John recorded that during a recent gale, the sea broke nearly halfway up the lighthouse, which was standing on a rock about 12 feet above ordinary tides. Carried away the keeper's boat, Keeper Snell, his firewood, his spring water, his barn, his cow, and every other removable article. But through her own instinct or sagacity, quote, the cow managed to reach the shore of a neighboring island. So nature is not necessarily a match for a sagacious cow. So the original lantern was replaced in 1842 with a larger lantern, and that same year, this beautiful red cross was painted on the tower. Now, I have heard comments, usually stateside, and from other sources, that the red cross is a common feature of Canadian lighthouses. Red stripes are, red bands are, but a red cross is not. I am not aware of any other Canadian lighthouse with a cross such as this on it.
Chris Miles spent much of his life as a lighthouse keeper for the Canadian Coast Guard, and he's now telling us what we're seeing on this Bar Harbor Whale Watch Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour, which took place July 29th. This is the second part of a two-part show as we hit some of the lighthouses farthest up the coast. If you missed the first part of the show, all episodes of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine are archived at 929theticket.com, so you can get yourself caught up anytime. Right now, we're heading across the bay for an obscure lighthouse in New Brunswick. Then it's up to the Wolves and over to Grand Manan. Stand by. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Today is part 2 of a two-part show. It's the second half of a Grand Slam Lighthouse tour up the Maine coast to Canada, offered up by Bar Harbor Whale Watch on July 29th. We hit 18 lighthouses in just one day. We're now up to a lighthouse that is barely a lighthouse. It's in New Brunswick up the coast from Eastport. Chris Miles is our Canadian lighthouse expert.
All right, we're just off Bliss Island's lighthouse, and this lighthouse is a testament to the fading importance of lighthouses. If you look to the left of the white lighthouse, you'll see red over white day mark. That is the current lighthouse that's replaced this structure in behind it. Now, the structure in behind isn't particularly beautiful. It's rather functional, but it does look like a lighthouse. What's in front of it looks like, well, it doesn't look like a lighthouse. So this is another Canadian light with an American connection. Samuel Bliss was born in 1750, and he later made his living as a merchant in Greenfield, Massachusetts. But darn it all, he had extra loyalty to the crown, and that got him banished from the colony by the Proscription Act of 1778. And to add insult to injury, he fought with the British Army in New York and New Jersey during the Revolutionary War. But it was a good thing for Samuel Bliss, because the Crown rewarded him in 1784 with 500 acres along the river in Latang in New Brunswick, and later with a nearby large island, which is the island we're sitting off right now, Bliss Island. So we've already talked about Head Harbor Lighthouse being established in 1829 to mark the southern side of the northern entrance to Passamaquoddy Bay. So it only made sense that another lighthouse would eventually be built to mark the northern side of this entrance. We're about 8 kilometers or 5 miles northeast of Head Harbor Light. Also marks the entrance to the protected anchorages of Bliss Harbour and Latang Harbour. Jarvis Clark was the first keeper here. The light was lit in 1871. And his annual salary was a princely $200. As I've mentioned, lightkeepers were not well paid then or now. But he was on a large wooded island. He could cut all the firewood he needed and kept livestock, cows, chickens, everything you would need to survive. So in 1874, the Department of Marine, who took care of lighthouses, paid $250 for the land which the lighthouse stands on. And as I mentioned, there was lots of wood to cut. The house itself, though, although warm perhaps with heat from a wood stove, was not particularly pleasant to live in. You have to understand that the light and the house were the same structure, and you had to deal with the smell from the oil lamps, kerosene lamps, which the keeper said the smell of which was anything but agreeable or pleasant. He made regular appeals, his name was Clark by the way, for a detached dwelling, or at the very least some kind of addition to the quarters to house his large family, and by 1876 a new dwelling went up near the lighthouse, so they didn't have to live in the lighthouse itself. This particular light that we're seeing now, the concrete tower, was built in 1964. It's a fairly common design in Canada, built to replace older wooden towers. It's concrete with a fog alarm / engine room building attached to it. But even though it's not that exciting to look at, when you had the combination of this tower and the two dwellings that would have sat up on the field above it and all the outbuildings, it would have made a very, very pretty sight. It was a community into itself, with the two keepers and the families, with the cattle they kept, the gardens they kept, the lawns were mowed. I've got some pictures taken in the late 70s and early 80s of this station before it was destaffed around 1986. It was immaculately kept. The lawns were mowed, the gardens. It was just an absolutely beautiful sight. And as you can see now, it's fading and being forgotten by time. We've got the new light on the point, which means there's still need for a light here. But as you'll notice, or maybe if you're not familiar with the site, there's a small concrete pad just below the concrete tower. That's where the foghorn would have stood, and there is no foghorn there anymore. So essentially we've got an LED light you can barely see on the top of this galvanized tower. And even though it's not perhaps picturesque in the traditional sense of a lighthouse, it's really important for you to understand the evolution of lighthouses, and this really illustrates that well. So picture that point with the two keepers' houses and all the buildings and the mowed lawn, and then fast forward to 2017, where we've got a so-called new lighthouse, which is now empty, and a brand new, well, it's not a lighthouse, tower on the shore, which now serves as the light to mark Bliss Islands.
I admit, of the 18 lighthouses we hit on the Grand Slam tour, this one was the most yawn-inducing. This lighthouse tour was scheduled to end by 6 p.m. In truth, we ended up a half an hour late because we got a little distracted.
Just about 3 o'clock. 2 of them, and blowing. Dead ahead, whale dead ahead.
We're on the way out to the Wolves, some islands where our next lighthouse waits, and up pops 2 finback whales. Zach Cliver is chief naturalist for Bar Harbor Whale Watch, and he's on board.
Okay, well, the finback whale is the second largest whale on Earth. They can be up to 89 feet in length, and they can weigh up to 260,000 pounds. Typically, the finback whales that we have here in the Gulf of Maine are in the 40 to 60 foot range and weighing in at probably somewhere around 80 to 90,000 pounds. They're long, sleek, they're submarine-like in shape. They're fast swimming. They're potentially very fast swimming. They were known to the early whalers as the greyhound of the sea. Looks like some porpoise up here at 11 o'clock, out about 800 feet away as well. So they can be very fast swimming. They can dive deep. They can come up far away, and they do not lift their tail out of the water when they dive down. Only rarely do they lift their tail up. But when they dive, they often arch their back high up out of the water, and they show a lot of themselves. There you go, 2 o'clock. One of the whales is up on our right side now. There's one of the whales has surfaced not far from us. It was swimming from 1 o'clock towards 12 o'clock. So hold on, we'll turn and move that direction. There it is, 12 o'clock. Okay, the whale's just up ahead of us. We're going to turn the boat so it'll be on one side. Here's a whale now at 9 o'clock, close to us. So here we have 2 whales, one next to us at 10 o'clock and one in front of us. And we're We're going to pull back here and pause. We'll just stop the boat right here. If we could just stop the boat in one spot right here, we'll just pause here and let those whales stay together. Here's a whale, 2 o'clock. One of the whales is up on our right side there. We had a nice look at the 2 whales, and they were near the boat at one point there. We know there's a whale over here on the left a little bit. We're going to have to go slow, but we're going to start moving back toward the lighthouse. And, of course, we'll keep looking for other whales as we go. But how was that? Was that fun? Okay.
The finback whales put on a good show for a few minutes. But eventually, Chris Miles, our Canadian lighthouse expert, gets his microphone back as we pull close to the next lighthouse.
That was awesome. Thanks, Zach. They are, Canadian whales are quite obliging. You haven't smelled bad breath till you've smelled whale breath, by the way. Nice view. Beautiful. Starboard side, 3 o'clock. I do believe I have been upstaged by a whale. Or at least the wolves have. The wolves lighthouse has been upstaged by a whale. Someone asked if I was still here. I am indeed. So we'll make this quick. This is Southwest Wolf Lighthouse, built in 1871. And we're at the southeast point of southern Wolf Island. November 20th of that year, Keeper William Klein lit the light, not this particular one. And for his services, the Department of Marine paid him $500, which is actually quite a bit. Considering Bliss Islands, Keeper got $200. But you look at the location of this place, it's a pretty wild place. Fortunately for him, he didn't have to go too far to light the lamps because the light was actually on the top of his house, which sat up where this present fiberglass tower is. Circular wick kerosene lights, and I just want to take a quick side road and tell you that about kerosene. I don't know if you're aware, but kerosene is a Canadian invention. It's actually a Nova Scotia invention by a man by the name of Abraham Pineo Gesner, who was born in Cornwallis in the Valley in Nova Scotia, lived a lot of his life in St. John, New Brunswick. He was a geologist and a natural historian. He did a lot of research in minerals, and in 1846 he developed a process to refine a liquid from coal, bitumen, and oil shale, and the new discovery was called kerosene, which burned a lot more cleanly and was a lot less expensive than other products such as whale oil, which had been used in lights to varying degrees of success, but it's not a highly refined product, and we shouldn't mention whale oil with beautiful whales, living whales around us. But let's get back to the Wolves, where the kerosene light was maintained by the keeper. A cold place. Can you imagine this place in the wintertime? Just think about it. It's quite glorious right now, but extremely exposed. No protection. You can see the foundation of the original keeper's house and lighthouse to the left of the lighthouse. See the yellow moss growing on the lichens growing on the stones? You'll see the helicopter pad to the right. He found that in the winter of 1873, the clockwork for rotating the light was working poorly or not at all, and so the department sent out a machinist from St. John. They found out the problem was oil on the wheels. The light rotated on chariot wheels. It was congealing, basically slowing the whole light down due to the intense cold. So they installed a stove in the lantern to create heat so that the oil would not congeal and the light would rotate. And now you look at our modern LED lights and even this little rotating light, and congealing because of the cold, it's unthinkable. So it's amazing how far technology has come. So by 1900, this was a station that didn't have a regular foghorn. It does not have a foghorn now, so unfortunately Bob can't do his radio trick here. But the keeper was supplied with a hand foghorn, which was basically like a large suitcase made out of wood with a handle on top to carry it around, and a handle on the side with bellows in it and a trumpet with a little reed inside, and you pumped that thing for all you were worth when you heard a boat blowing. So they were saying, "Where am I?" And you were saying, "You're right here." And that's the way it was done. There was no automatic fog signals, no horn that blew itself hour after hour. You actually had to keep your windows open and your doors open, and a member of the family, a child, a mother, usually not the lightkeeper because he was busy doing other things, would keep an ear out rather, for vessels asking, "Where am I?" by blowing their little horns.
We're on board the Friendship 5, a fast Bar Harbor Whale Watch catamaran. We've got 5 lighthouses to go on the Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour, and the next one is Long Eddy Reach Light, but you may know it as the Whistle. We'll give the whistle a holler when we get back in a moment. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket with Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. We're on a Bar Harbor Whale Watch boat approaching Grand Manan. This will be lighthouse number 14 out of the 18 we're visiting during this July 29th all-day tour. Today's show features part 2 of that tour. We're behind schedule. Not only did we run into a pair of finback whales, but we've just encountered another pod of 3. I've seen a lot of humpback whales in this particular channel. Often you can watch them from the cliffs on Grand Manan itself. But to have this many finback whales in this channel is something I wasn't expecting. Finally, we approach the northwest corner of Grand Manan, which is where we find a lighthouse affectionately known as the Whistle. Our Canadian lighthouse expert is Chris Miles.
So welcome to Grand Manan and welcome to the Whistle, which is the local name for Long Eddy Point. This is a lighthouse that was destaffed around 1988, but established, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Canadian lights started out their careers as fog signal stations, and this is the case at the Whistle at Long Eddy, established in 1874. The building, the original building, was about halfway down the cliff between the beach and the tower, and it was built on land owned by James Tatton, who ended up becoming the first keeper of the fog signal. And it was James Tatton who had found the body of a man by the name of James Lawson in his barn nearby. This was in 1857. Lawson had survived the wreck of the Lord Ashburton on Ashburton Head around the corner here, and crawled into the barn and made it as far as the barn, only to die. But it let James Tatton know that there had been a shipwreck, and he was able to save 7 people from the Lord Ashburton. He actually scaled a cliff and saved 7 crew members off the Ashburton. The Ashburton was also the impetus for the establishment of Swallowtail Light. Here we have our standard square tower built circa 1964 with the fog alarm building on the corner. When I say fog alarm, I mean fog signal. It's just a local term we use in the Maritimes. It replaced the second foghorn. You can just see at the base of the cliff where it turns to trees, and there is Ken Ingersoll, the keeper of the light, saluting us. That is a custom salute, which we're very glad to hear. I've been in touch with Ken. I mentioned at the Wolves when they had a hand foghorn, if they wanted to hear from the lightkeeper, they had to blow a horn. Now all you have to do is send a text. And that's a wonderful horn. It's a 1,000-watt horn, actually very similar, the same as the horn at West Quoddy, but absolutely wonderful to hear. But you can see the base, see the concrete foundation on the beach. That was the second foghorn. That was a diaphone horn. For those of you not familiar with the diaphone, it's a Canadian development or a Canadian invention based on a diaphone pipe organ pipe, which was the invention of Robert Hope Jones, an Englishman. And a man by the name of John Northey, a Toronto manufacturer, said, "Wow, that's a deep sound. I think I can turn that into a foghorn." And he did that by creating a reciprocating piston and a resonator, which is essentially a horn with compressed air blowing through it, which created that beautiful with the grunt at the end. And that's what the Whistle was. It was actually initially a whistle, a fog whistle, and then received a diaphone foghorn. But I had mentioned that kerosene was a Canadian development and invention, and so was the diaphone foghorn. And both of those commodities, the kerosene and the diaphone foghorn, spread like wildfire around the world and remained the most effective and efficient ways of lighting and bringing sound to light stations until, in some parts of the world, until the 1980s. And as a Canadian and a lighthouse not to boot, the former keeper, I'm very proud of those two things, the diaphone and the foghorn, and the light, rather, kerosene light. You can see 2 houses, one with a black roof, one with a red roof. Those are the 2 lightkeepers' homes. The light was actually established in 1966. Until then, it was primarily only actually a fog signal station. So they built houses for the head keeper and the assistant keeper, and the station's been destaffed since 1988. This is also pretty well bar none the best place to watch sunsets on Grand Manan Island.
Oh, great. Now even more people know about it. It's true, there's a platform next to the lighthouse where locals and visitors gather at sunset, and it has got to be one of the best sunset viewpoints in the entire Northeast. Another one is on the other end of the island. Southwest Head is a breathtaking cliff, dropping from a plateau straight down basalt cliffs for 150 to 200 feet. That's also where our next lighthouse is perched, on top of that extraordinary cliff.
All right, Southwest Head, Southern Head, locally known as Southern Head. The original light was built in 1880 and essentially as a guide for vessels transiting and fishing in the southwest approaches to Grand Manan and this north channel of the Bay of Fundy. I understand that the builders incorrectly placed the alignment of the building. And consequently the lantern wasn't installed correctly, and one of the panes in the lantern was a blank pane because the light was not required on the landward side. Unfortunately, the way they had installed the lantern meant that the pane that was blacked out was facing the seaward side, and that wasn't so good because a lighthouse is better than a dark house, so they rectified that and got that fixed up, and
I heard that.
The lightkeeper started his long tenure there. As in many Canadian lights of the time, it was a wooden structure with a keeper's house attached, and it had a catoptric or a reflector light shown from 47.5 meters, which is about 156 feet, give or take a foot or two, above sea level, and that's what you're looking at there. Total cost of the lighthouse, dwelling and light apparatus was a bargain, I would say, just shy of 4,200 Canadian dollars. First keeper was Walter B. McLaughlin. He was a veteran keeper who'd worked on Gannett Rock, and those of you who were on the cruise last year and the year before would have seen Gannett. Very small place. He served on Gannett for 37 years, and as a reward for good behavior, he got posted to the top of this 156-foot cliff. Salary was $500 a year. McLaughlin immediately found that the light was built very poorly, as many were at the time they were thrown up very quickly. Dwelling was cold and drafty, and the rain and snow beat through both roof and walls. So he decided to buy his own lumber and make necessary repairs and built a barn and an addition on the dwelling, for which he spent a total of $2,820, which is substantial for the day. We're talking the late 1880s. The last keeper left Southwest Head in 1987. There were 3 dwellings up there at one point, and this lighthouse was in better shape than it is now. So the houses have all been moved. They're now private dwellings scattered around Grand Manan. And this lighthouse is slated to lose its foghorn building. The foghorn you can see just in front of the lantern on the deck, on the balcony, is now out of service. The whole building is gutted. The light only comes on at night. But it's strange, with this light falling apart, there's so much activity around it, Coast Guard activity. It's a major refueling station for Coast Guard helicopters, and also a major communications center for Canadian Coast Guard radio. And there's also a Wi-Fi, I believe a Wi-Fi antenna on the lighthouse. And they are talking about bringing Wi-Fi to the keepers on Machias Seal Island. So they're going to be finally entering the 21st century.
And that would be interesting because ever since early in the 18th century, we couldn't even agree on who owns that island. But that's our next destination. It'll take us about 3 minutes to get there. We're on the Bar Harbor Whale Watch Grand Slam Tour of Northern Lighthouses in Maine and Canada. The next one is lighthouse number 16 on this tour of 18 lighthouses. Meet you there in a moment. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Every summer, Bar Harbor Whale Watch makes some special trips to see lighthouses. A lot of them. The trip we're on today happened on July 29th. Another one took place this weekend, hitting 16 lighthouses down the mid-coast of Maine. September 7th, they're hitting 7 lighthouses around Acadia. And on October 14th, I'll be hosting a trip from Bar Harbor to Bangor up the Penobscot River, hitting 10 lighthouses along the way. Details at barharborwhales.com. I'll now turn the mic over to Chris Niles. He is our Canadian lighthouse expert. In fact, he was a lighthouse keeper for the Canadian Coast Guard for a long time, including this lighthouse right here.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Gray Zone. And that is because it's claimed by both the U.S. and Canada. This goes back a long, long way. This lighthouse was established in 1832, actually established as 2 lighthouses to allow it to be identified because it did not have rotating lights originally. And this current tower was built in 1915. The idea was to aid shipping going to St. John, and the two lights that I told you about were basically to avoid confusion with Gannett Rock and Head Harbor Light. The original lights here burned seal and porpoise oil, and later we've talked about kerosene. They switched to kerosene, which was a much better light, and the current light is a small APRB 252 for those of you who are interested in the technical name. And as you can see, for a small light, it's actually quite bright. It's got probably a 20-mile range or so. The amount of fog here, I worked as a lightkeeper for 4 shifts here in the early 1990s, and I went through a lot of the old log books. And one year they had 2,500 hours of thick weather. That also includes snow. There's only 7,000 odd hours in a year. So 2,500 hours of foghorn time. When I was a lightkeeper here, the foghorns were mounted on the tower itself about halfway up by that middle window that you can see on the tower. One pointing away and one pointing directly at the house. Some brilliant engineer decided that the lightkeeper's ears didn't matter too much, but we had a decibel meter in the keeper's house. I lived in the house that you can see just to the right of the tower, and they clocked it at something like, or not clocked, measured the decibel level at something like 110 in the living room. So after a while, occupational health and safety got involved, and they moved the tower towards the northern part of the island, the northern end of the island. And a couple of years ago, within the last year or so, the foghorn has been decommissioned. The original keeper's house was replaced in '23 by a new house, and these houses date from the late 50s. There are 2 houses. You can see one to the left of the tower. That was the assistant keeper. The head keeper lived in the other house. Since 1987, though, this has been a rotational bachelor station. When I worked here in the early 90s, and this is the case today as well, the helicopter from St. John would pick us up from wherever we lived or the closest base and fly us out for 28-day rotations. So there's 2 keepers on duty now.
One of those lighthouse keepers is Ralph Eldridge. I've met him a bunch of times on my own trips out to Machias Seal Island. Ralph has become quite an expert on birds, since this is arguably the single most important seabird nesting colony along the Maine and New Brunswick coast. It's loaded with puffins and puffin relatives like razorbills, murres, and black guillemots. All of those birds are flying around us by the thousands right now as we float near this lighthouse. This is the only puffin colony off the Maine coast that you can visit. Andy Patterson's Bold Coast Tours goes out from Cutler. Pete Wilcox of Sea-Watch Tours in Grand Manan goes out there too. When you go out to visit the island, say hi to Ralph for me.
I mentioned the sovereignty issue, which is the reason this station is still staffed. This is the last staffed lighthouse in the Maritime provinces. As I mentioned, there are staffed lighthouses in Newfoundland and British Columbia, but Newfoundland is not officially part of the Maritime provinces. It's part of Atlantic Canada. And because of this sovereignty issue, the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs actually covers the costs of lightkeepers for the Canadian Coast Guard. When I worked here, I loved when the tour boats would come from Seal Cove and Grand Manan, Andy Patterson coming from Cutler, and of course the famous Barna Norton from Jonesport and his son John, both now passed on. Barna Norton had a great family history attached to Machias Seal Island and claimed it as the U.S. territory of Machias Seal Islands, and would often plant the stars and stripes on the island while our Canadian flag and the Coast Guard flag you see below it would fly. But we had a wonderful relationship, an amicable relationship. I think it was great business for Barna, and no matter who you think owns the island, I think the most important thing is that there's a continuous presence on the island, and this very, very important breeding sanctuary is protected. And that's largely because of a continuous presence on this island.
From here, we head back toward Bar Harbor. There are 2 lighthouses left on this 18 lighthouse tour with Bar Harbor Whale Watch. These are both lighthouses we have visited on this program several times before, and they are visited daily by lighthouse tours going out of Bar Harbor. So we'll just give them a quick shout out. Our American lighthouse expert is Jeremy D'Entremont.
This is, of course, Winter Harbor Light. Very pretty, privately owned lighthouse. It's been privately owned for a very long time. We are on the west side of the Schoodic Peninsula here. The lighthouse was established here in 1854. Originally had a 5th order Fresnel lens. The light was 37 feet above the water. First keeper was Frederick Garish, one of the early settlers of the community of Winter Harbor. All right, so here we are at our 18th and final lighthouse on what I think has been a pretty awesome day today. This is Egg Rock Lighthouse. It's been called Egg Rock since before the American Revolution. Because of the growing ferry traffic, that's largely the reason for the establishment of this lighthouse. Financed by Congress in 1874, $15,000. It was built during the following year, went into service on November 1st, 1875.
And that voice belongs to Jeremy D'Entremont, president of the American Lighthouse Foundation, and our lighthouse guide for the American lighthouses on board the Bar Harbor Whale Watch Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour down east. This has been a two-part episode recapping 18 lighthouses along the way. 2 more lighthouse tours are coming up, a short morning tour of 7 local lighthouses on September 7th, and a 10 lighthouse tour up the Penobscot River on October 14th. I'll host that one. Details at barharborwhales.com. Bar Harbor Whale Watch is a sponsor of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, as is Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket.